What did Charles know about the sex trafficking? Well, Andrew was bringing the people, prostitutes and girlfriends, into Buckingham Palace. He was refusing to give their names. Often he would just call them Mrs. Windsor. And so the police didn't really have proper logs. There were all access areas passes to people like Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And this would have been reported to the Queen. And we've got to remember, in the last 2 years of her reign, she reigned very much alongside Charles. I mean, they would have shared information together.
Just the Facts today brings you royal author Andrew Lownie. He's got increasing calls for King Charles to abdicate the crown to Prince William because of Andrew, not Andrew Lownie, but the former Prince Andrew, because of the Epstein crisis. My guest today has said it's now being shown that the king was warned about his brother 6 years ago and did nothing. So welcome, Andrew. I am so excited to have you with me today. What was King Charles warned about?
Well, he got an email in 2019 saying that Andrew was basically using his position as a trade envoy to line his own pocket. He was working with a man called David Rowlands. But actually, I mean, there have been stories along these lines for the last 10, 15 years. So there were plenty of warnings for everyone, not just King Charles, but the police, the Buckingham Palace in general, the government. So that's a slight issue. But as I write in Entitled, I mean, there were plenty of people bringing stories to the palace, asking for a right to reply. The stories were being denied. When they were proved to be true, there were legal threats. Amy Robach of ABC Television wanted to get an interview, or at least some right to reply, about after she did an interview with Virginia Giuffre. And the palace pushed back and said that if you run this interview, you will not be given access to the Prince and Princess of Wales. So there's plenty of evidence, quite separately from that 2019 email, of the palace. And Charles, I think, must have known at the palace, because from my research as a royal writer over the years, the monarch is always well briefed on any controversial issues. The peace protection officers report back. We got to remember that the palace is filled with ex-spooks and various people who will tell them things. And so I think what's happened is that the palace has been caught out. They never expected these Epstein leaks. This was the evidence that really has been the tipping point in terms of forcing the palace on the back foot. I mean, even when my book came out with plenty of evidence of Andrew's wrongdoing, nothing happened in the palace or with the police or with the government.
It's sometimes the cover-up that's worse than the crimes, but you support the monarchy, as I understand it, and you have huge expertise based on your research and your prolific writing, including the book entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, which was a dual biography of then Prince Andrew and his ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, which explored their lives, pretty extravagant lives, I would say, and their relationship to various scandals. So before we get to Andrew and sexual misconduct and possible misconduct in office, let's go back to this thing about what King Charles might have known, and both about the sexual misconduct and this possible thing called misconduct in office, which involved leaking confidential British financial information to Jeffrey Epstein that was of financial benefit to him, and why you think that this could be, as you've said, there are increasing calls that Charles has been compromised by the scandal, that the only way out is for him to abdicate, to pass the king on to William, who so far has been seen to be completely clean. So is it likely that he would be forced to abdicate?
Well, I mean, I think if he is seen to be complicit in perverting the course of justice, then I think there would be huge public anger, and it would make his position completely untenable. So I'm not the only one who's suggesting this. I don't want him to go. I think he's a good man. But I think the only way to lance the boil and deal with this crisis may be for him to fall on his sword, because otherwise we're going to continue with this drip feed of revelations. And it's going to infect the whole monarchy, altogether. I mean, you've asked about two questions. What did Charles know about the sex trafficking? Well, Andrew was bringing the people, prostitutes and girlfriends, into Buckingham Palace. He was refusing to give their names. Often he would just call them Mrs. Windsor. And so the police didn't really have proper logs. There were all access areas passes to people like Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And this would have been reported to the Queen. And we've got to remember, in the last few years of her reign, she reigned very much alongside Charles. I mean, they would have shared information together. And also, we've got to remember that Charles has been on the throne for several years now. This scandal with Andrew has grown and grown. And you would have thought that he would have tried to head it off by investigating it and to find out what exactly did happen in terms of sex trafficking, and also these claims in the newspapers about financial corruption. I know, for example, that MI6, our Foreign Intelligence Service, went to the Queen or the Queen's private secretary complaining about a $5 million bribe in a suitcase in Kazakhstan. Now, I'm sure the Queen would have shared that information with Charles. Charles himself isn't completely clean. I mean, there are lots of stories of him giving, in return for cash, giving honors to people who've given money to Dumfries House. A friend of mine in intelligence who went to Dumfries House looked through the donors book and said every single one of those people was on our blacklist of people not to deal with. So this is why I think, he is deeply compromised and we kind of need to move on.
Let me ask you a question out of my ill-informed Americanism. Dumfries House is what?
Sorry, Dumfries House is a huge house in the south of Scotland that Charles basically decided he should buy from his own private monies to save for the nation, to save the collection, particularly of Chippendale furniture. And it's been his great sort of love. He's used it to develop the economy in what is quite a deprived area of Scotland. So a very, very, noble gesture. But in order to finance its restoration, he has had to take money from some very dodgy people. And I think that has raised all sorts of questions about his judgment.
This also, okay, so we have to go back because if he is to abdicate and turn the throne over to William, is William clean? Is there any evidence that he has any knowledge of anything or has done anything dodgy?
No, I mean, I don't think there's any evidence of William being compromised. I mean, one of his charities had money from someone who appears in the Epstein files, who's clearly not very salubrious. But I mean, those are mistakes that can easily be made. I don't think anyone would blame William for that. I think, the concern is that Charles was involved in paying the £12 million hush money. He probably contributed to it. There must have been questions about that. And maybe William was drawn in. I don't know. Normally they try and have sort of little buffers so that if the press gets wind of a story, they've got a sort of cutout. But I've not seen any evidence of William being aware of this. He has been pretty firm and ruthless about how William should be dealt with. I think he wanted him dealt with much earlier on. And if they had done so, I think this crisis wouldn't have grown in the way it has. This is a crisis of the royal family's own making. They kind of thought that if they kept quiet, the problem would go away. And they misjudged what actually did happen, which was the fact that these Epstein files were released.
And of course, there is this consequence of the Epstein files, which in America we thought of as sexual predation files. And we're finding out through these files that there's much more to Epstein, which included the leaking of possible confidential financial information from Prince Andrew to Epstein that has led to his arrest and questioning. But before we get to that, I want to stay a little bit longer on King Charles because you may know I was a former Watergate prosecutor, so I think of a lot of things in terms of Watergate. And one of the phrases that defined Watergate was, "What did he know and when did he know it?" said about then President Nixon. So the question really comes up here, did Charles know at the time, either about the sexual misconduct, but more importantly, about this financial misconduct in office and those allegations that was what his brother was engaged in? Because if he knew it then, and as you've said, he was very involved in governing in the last years of his mother's reign and was involved possibly, you mentioned hush money, and I assume that was the hush money paid to Virginia Giuffre, one of the victims who had made allegations that she was raped by then Prince Charles. So is it something that the king knew at the time, or learned very, very soon thereafter? So it's like Nixon. What did he know and when did he know it?
Well, that's a $64,000 question that the palace is refusing to answer. BBC put a series of similar questions to the palace, and they declined to answer any of them. And this is what's concerning people, that we're not getting straight answers, which, I mean, certainly my research bears up the fact that he knew and did nothing and hoped the problem would go away. I think more than just turning a blind eye. They were actively trying to suppress this story. And the fact that they haven't come clean on it does suggest that there's some truth in what my sources have been telling me.
Right. And of course, in Watergate, that was the cover-up, obstruction of justice that really is what brought down President Nixon, more than the underlying crime. Although I will point out, of course, that the crimes alleged here weren't a break-in at the political opponent's headquarters. These are crimes of horrific value, pedophilia, and then again, the money and giving the information that benefited Epstein that was confidential information. So let's talk about that. And the newly released Epstein files do suggest that Andrew and also Peter Mandelson, who was the ambassador from Britain to the U.S., who has been relieved of his duties because of the relationship to Epstein, which also includes passing on financial information of value to Epstein. What is the evidence that King Charles knew about that? You said you had an email in 2019 that told the king about that. Is there more than that? Or not that that isn't enough. That is enough, but is there more?
Well, I don't have the email. I mean, it's now emerged that the king had that email, the 2019. But as I said, my book
Right.
is filled
Yes.
with stories of press coverage of Andrew leaking sensitive material going back 15 years. This is material that was in the papers that Charles must have read. I mean, the world knew about these things. They're in my book. I have detail after detail. And this included, for example, especially requesting Treasury briefing papers on the Islamic banking crisis so that he could then pass them on to one of his business associates, David Rowlands, who was buying an Islamic bank. Stories of the Royal Bank of Scotland, which had been taken into public ownership during the banking crisis, which sensitive, again, commercial information there that would have been very useful to Epstein or any businessman, any financier. This stuff is not new. It
And the public
was in my book.
disclosure
A
of
lot of it
this.
has been in the press. So well, I mean, the fact is that, anyone opening the paper one morning would have seen these stories and would have said, this doesn't look good. Sarah Ferguson was actually caught on film selling access to her ex-husband for £500,000. Nothing happened to her. Nothing happened. No, there was no suggestion that Andrew should stand down from his post. There was no internal investigation. There was nothing. And this happened time and time again. Money was in the high court actions was found to have been paid to the Yorks that they couldn't explain, millions of pounds. And yet, again, nothing was ever done. And this was in the public domain. Everyone knew about it. There would have been an opportunity last August when my book came out. There's 140,000 words, much of it focused on the financial shenanigans of Andrew, that would have given plenty of evidence and ammunition to whether it was King Charles or the police or the government to deal with this and address it, but nothing was done.
And the unexpected consequences of the newly released Epstein files are that this financial information passing on was revealed and has led to the arrest and questioning of both former Prince Andrew and Peter Mandelson about this information. First of all, let me just say, in America, we don't have this kind of arrest for questioning and then release under caution, which is what has happened. So is there anything that you can help us in America to understand about that process and what it means and where Andrew is right now in terms of that procedure?
Yes, well, I mean, it was a very strange thing for the police to do because in the end, he was only brought in for questioning. They released him after 11 hours. They could have held him for 36 hours. That doesn't seem to, didn't require policemen turning up at 8 o'clock in the morning and surrounding his house so he couldn't escape. Um, uh, so it would be very easy to ask him to go to the police station. Now, what's emerged is that the reason that Peter Mandelson was arrested the other day was that he was actually planning to go to the British Virgin Islands. And my own feeling is the reason that there was that raid on Andrew was that he was about to make a midnight flit, probably to the Middle East. And that's why they had to take him in. Now, they haven't confiscated his passport. They haven't put him on bail. He is just a person of interest in their inquiries. So, and they're searching his properties and things. So it is very strange. I know that he's been getting rid of destroying evidence since the beginning of December. So I'm not sure how much they're going to find, but maybe they'll cease to find things on hard drives. So it's a
And
very
talk
strange
about
way
that.
to behave. But what it's done, I think, is to place a lot of this on as sub judice. It's going to be much harder for the press to report on this story now that the law enforcement has got involved.
Can you talk about the destruction of evidence that you referenced? I have not read anything about that. And again, the analogy to Watergate and destruction of evidence is quite clear and very damaging. So I'd like to hear about that.
Yes, well, it hasn't appeared in the press. It's come from one of my sources. This is information I'm giving you. But lorries were being, when from the beginning of December, lorries were transporting papers to a shredder in central London. And lots of documents were destroyed. Now, presumably, that's also happened with people he was working with. He had a private secretary called Amanda Thirsk. Presumably, some of the point men, the business people he was dealing with, like David Stern and David Rowlands, have done the same. So I think this is why the police felt that they had to move too, that a lot of the evidence was being destroyed. Now, some of it may be on hard drives, to maybe copies in various places. But I think the feeling was that they needed to move swiftly now in order to prevent any more evidence being destroyed. And this, again, is not a sign of an innocent man.
Exactly. And the crime that and maybe the crime is the wrong word, but that the questioning was about something called misconduct in office. And is that a crime in England? Is it treason? What exactly is it that he's being questioned about?
Well, misconduct in public office carries as a maximum penalty life imprisonment. More often than not, it's used for actually quite low-level public officials who perhaps have been not very diligent in their work. For example, an off-duty policeman who didn't interfere when a crime was being committed could have conducted misconduct in public office. But I think the charges against Andrew are much more serious. They're about leaking quite sensitive commercial, diplomatic, military secrets in return for money. Very obvious to see that him sending stuff to Epstein and then discussing Epstein paying off Sarah Ferguson's debts. And I've been talking about this, there's a very clear indication now that Epstein was a Russian intelligence asset, that he was tasked to bring in members of the royal family, other members of the royal families in other countries, as well as high-level political figures, that Andrew was easily, I talk about an American intelligence report on several podcasts recently that I've been shown. I think I've got a copy here of him actually willingly operating with Russian intelligence and with the gangs with which they work. I can't find it. And this then is much, much more serious than just the sort of minor offense of not perhaps being as diligent as you could have been in public office. I'm sure his lawyers will make the case that he wasn't a public official, there are legal technicalities, or he can't have a fair trial. But it seems to me from the material we've seen in these Epstein leaks that there's countless examples of him sharing information that he shouldn't have been, which was secret and shouldn't have been shared. And I've been threatened by it with dealing with secret information just from doing interviews with people in government. So and without sharing any of this material. So I do think there's a strong case. I mean, I assume that they're using this time to build their case because clearly they need to get their ducks in a row. But the sex trafficking, I think, again, those charges could be leveled, but it will be a matter of finding the girls, getting them prepared to talk, and actually being able to show that they were trafficked and Andrew knew they were being trafficked.
Now, let's go back to the financial information and explain, if you can, Andrew's positions in the government that gave him access to this confidential information that should not have been shared.
Well, when Andrew left the Navy in 2001, he was looking for another job. He was only 40. The Queen was very keen that he should take on this role, which her cousin, the Duke of Kent, had had since 1976. And this was to use the soft power of the monarchy to promote British trade, to lead trade delegations to particularly places like the Middle East, to reach bits of government that politicians couldn't reach. And initially, it worked well. He was being tasked by the Foreign Office and Department of Trade with a sort of government body in between called UKTI, UK Trade and Investment. But the two problems arose. One was that there wasn't proper supervision. He kind of fell between different stools. And the other was that he decided to go sort of off-piste, and rather than following his brief, he thought he knew better than all the diplomats. So when he was sent to sell, for example, I don't know, aircraft to the Middle East, he suggested that they should perhaps lease it. He left functions early. He actually cancelled some meetings because he wanted to go and play golf. He went chatting to pretty young women rather than shake hands with people in the VIP lineup. Whole series of things. So he became counterproductive. And instead of embassies bidding for him, they actually didn't want to have him. He was kind of imposed on them. They didn't know what to do with him. Instead of staying in the embassy, he would stay in hotels at public expense so that he could have sex workers come in and see him, so that he could meet very dodgy people that the ambassador wouldn't approve of. And increasingly, he was bringing people like Jeffrey Epstein on these trips and actually fixing business for them rather than actually fixing business for the British taxpayer. And we even had, for example, trips to Kazakhstan where he took a £3.85 million commission to introduce a Greek water company to Kazakhstan. So, clearly it was a system that wasn't working. He was corrupt. But I think what's so frightening is this intelligence document that I've seen, and there have been stories since in the press backing up the fact he was quite voluntarily leaking sensitive political, diplomatic, and indeed even intelligence material to a foreign power, knowing that it was going to a foreign power. We know that not just the Russians, but the Chinese had spies in his entourage. The man who was actually developing one of his charities, which turned out to be a business initiative in China called Tenbo, was actually banned from Britain for spying. And the intelligence services of the world saw that the easiest way to penetrate the British establishment was to basically cozy up to Andrew and Sarah Ferguson because they were greedy and very vulnerable and there was no oversight.
It sounds very serious. Do you expect charges to be brought against Andrew?
Well, I mean, I think charges should be brought given the evidence there is. Whether in this country we are still at the stage or have reached the stage of arresting a former member of the royal family, I just don't know. My instinct is they're going to kick this into the long grass for the simple reason that the royal family do not want their dirty washing aired in public. And they will be using every opportunity to try and shut down this case.
Sounds like America to me, and the cover-up that's going on now of the corruption in our White House and our president. But let me ask you on another topic. There is some information that you had a lunch with the brother of Jeffrey Epstein, Mark Epstein, who has long said that he believes that his brother did not die by suicide, but died by murder, and that he has now had a second autopsy conducted and has proof that confirms what has been suggested in the first, that this was murder. Can you tell me anything about that and about your lunch with Mark?
Yes, I mean, I had lunch with him at the National Arts Club in New York, which I'm a member of. He was very forthcoming. I mean, he said he would announce this sometime in February, and so this may be coming soon. He did also say that he carried a firearm. He was worried for his own safety, so I don't know who was after him. But we've also had Michael Baden, who is the New York coroner, in a British paper just the other day, present new evidence that he thinks suggests that Epstein was murdered. I've actually had sources, my American intelligence sources have also quite separately said that they believe that he was murdered. And certainly looking at the evidence myself, I mean, an inmate has actually gone public the other day saying it was impossible for them to commit suicide there. We know that the cameras weren't working at certain times, that the guards fell asleep at very appropriate times, that the lawyers didn't feel that Epstein at the beginning of this process was really in a suicidal frame of mind. We know that the people who ran the correctional facility had no penalty for losing this very important prisoner, that he was on suicide watch, and yet his cellmate was removed from his cell the day before he committed suicide. So lots and lots of things don't really add up. And the story is that Epstein was prepared to squeal. A number of very important people were worried about that happening. And we have to ask, I mean, who actually could have had access to a cell to do this? Was it an inmate, as some people suspect? How would that inmate have been I mean, I can see how he might have been persuaded, remission of sentence, all sorts of things. But who would have been in a position to persuade an inmate to do that?
And there is reporting, Dr. Baden, who you mentioned, sat in on the original autopsy on behalf of the Epstein family and has long said that the evidence suggests that it was not possible to be suicide, that if he had thrown himself hard enough from being tied to the bunk, one, where is the noose? Why is that missing? Two, why was nothing on the top bunk disturbed? Everything was not toppled. It was laid out neatly, and it would have taken so much force to have broken the bones in his neck, as the autopsy showed, that it's impossible that those things wouldn't have toppled. So, and there's also reporting, you mentioned his cellmate. The cellmate that he had was reportedly a police officer who had murdered 4 people, which seems like an odd cellmate to assign to someone who was of such importance as Jeffrey Epstein was. So there is all of that. Of course, given today's date, if he's going to release it in February, by the time this episode is released and by the time you, our listeners, are listening, it's either out or he's not made his February deadline. But I certainly will be looking forward to anything that Mark Epstein releases about another set of evidence that Jeffrey Epstein did not commit suicide. This has been totally fascinating. I am loving talking to you, and I really hope people will read not just Entitled, but your other books, because you give great insight into the monarchy and other people as well. And you write in a very accessible way. You're a historian by training, but
Thank
you
you.
write not you write in a way that's very narrative and very easy to read. So I do recommend your books to all our listeners, and I hope you will join me again to talk about some of the other books that you've written, because they're all really fascinating topics. And I thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me. That's a pleasure. And I'd love to come back at some stage.